Welcome. In the last lecture, we examined the crucial transformations brought about by the revolutions of agriculture and iron, resulting in larger, more settled, and more complex societies in most of the African continent. In this lecture, I can state it very simply. We want to take a closer look at those societies. Now, Iron Age societies in Africa were organized in an endless variety of forms. Nonetheless, I'm going to describe in this lecture certain kinds of what I'll call building blocks. By that, I mean units binding or associating individuals together, relationships binding or associating individuals together, building blocks which have repeatedly appeared in the structure and the functioning of African communities. Now, one key to locating such building blocks is to consider the universal questions, I believe they are, surrounding identity. I think that every person struggles in some sense with questions like, who am I? What am I? What am I a part of? Who are my people? Who are those people? What is it that makes those people similar or different from my people? Now, identities are always multiple. Everyone listening to this lecture has multiple identities. Everyone can give several answers to the question, who are you? Well, I'm a Smith or a Jones. I'm a Christian or a Jew. I'm a lawyer or a mechanic or a student. I'm Irish, or I'm Zulu. And not least, of course, I'm male, or I'm female. I'm black, or I'm white. Now, the specific answer, the specific identity which comes to the surface in response to the question, who are you, often depends on the context. At a certain moment, the most important thing in the world is whether you're male or female. And the same could be said, I think, for any of the other sorts of pairings, any of the other kinds of identities that I mentioned a moment ago. Still, certain kinds of identities seem to be privileged and have played important roles in African history and society, and I want to note three of them. First, identities and relationships built on kinship are important everywhere, but perhaps even especially so in Africa. Now, that's a generalization, and generalization can lead to stereotype, but I will stand by it. Kinship matters, and it matters a lot in Africa. Now, kinship can be literal. That is, it can be traceable, knowable, identifiable relations by blood or by marriage, or it can be assumed, it can be by mutual agreement. We agree to believe that we are descended from a given ancestor, although that was so many generations ago, nobody can actually prove it. Now, a second form of identity would be ethnic identity. When I said or offered the possible answers to who am I and said I'm Irish or I'm Zulu, I was getting at ethnic identities. It's important, so important that I'm going to take about the last third of this lecture and devote my attention to ethnicity. A third form of identity, often vital, is membership in a political unit, in a country. I'm part of a nation. I'm a citizen of a state. I'm inside a chiefdom or a kingdom. Now, in many of the lectures to follow, but not today, we will trace the rise and the fall of precisely such units. Now, let's focus for a bit on kinship then in Africa. Marriage and the families that result are, again, universals. With due caution to the dangers of generalization, we can offer some characteristics of family relations common in Africa in the past and or in the present. If you see a word that ends with the three letters GAM, fairly often the subject is marriage. I have in mind, of course, monogamy, for instance, or monogamous marriage, or polygamous marriage, polygamy. Although polygamous marriage, that is marriage involving more than one male, one female, one bride, one husband, has a long history in the Western world, it's fair to say that it's shown more staying power in Africa. Now, of course, in theory, there are three possibilities for polygamous marriage. You could have more than one husband, more than one wife. You could have one wife, more than one husband. That would be polyandry. And you can have one husband with more than one wife, and that would be polygyny. And it is, of course, the third of those that I'm talking about when I talk about the staying power of polygamous marriage, of polygynous marriage in Africa. In general, polygynous households, that is, those involving a single husband and more than one wife, have been more likely to emerge around a powerful or a wealthy male. Kings in African history fairly often had multiple, in some cases, numerous wives. And in a few cases, that's still true. The king of Swaziland today certainly would be a good example. Now, in more recent Africa, in today's Africa, to find instances of polygyny, which are still around, I would look to older generations and to rural settings. My longtime research partner, research collaborator, living in a rural village in Zambia, a man of about 60 years old, has two wives. But if you go to the city and you go to a younger generation, it's going to be increasingly rare. It's quite unusual among the young and the urban. Families, again a generalization, can of course be nuclear or extended, and we're more likely to find that a given household was and is more inclusive than the nuclear unit, either vertically, that is including more than one generation, grandparents, grandsons, etc., or laterally, what we would call cousins, nephews, nieces, etc., although the terminology for a first cousin in many African societies would in fact be brother or sister. Now, again, this is possibly and probably is related to rural cultures, etc. We don't have to think far to think of the rural past of the U.S. or other parts of the Western world where extended households were also more common than the nuclear household, which has become the, quote, norm. Now, let's consider another form of kinship, of a kinship-based building block. I'm going to call it the Unilineal Descent group. The Unilineal Descent group. And I think that they have indeed been quite important units of identity, of solidarity, you might say, in Africa, past and present. Now, unilineal, today we're going to be doing a lot of kind of prefix-suffix rearrangements here. Unilineal essentially means tracing descent, of course, through one parent, one gender, and not the other. Therefore, the two possibilities are patrilineal descent and matrilineal descent. In patrilineal systems, a child inherits membership in the group from the father. Now again, whether that's a boy or a girl child, both of them inherit membership in this descent group from the father. Matrilineal, of course, is exactly the opposite. Both the boy child and the girl child are going to inherit their membership in their primary descent group from the mother. Now, other terms which refer to unilineal descent groups would include clans and lineages. In other words, when we talk about clans and lineages, we're talking about unilineal descent groups in most cases. What's the difference between a clan and a lineage? Basically size. Let's do the math on this one. In Jomo Kenyatta's classic ethnography, he was the first president of Kenya, and we'll be talking about him, but he wrote an ethnography of his people, the Kikuyu peoples of central Kenya, back in the 1930s. And he tells us in the first chapter that the clan, the tribe, and the age set are the most important things in making the Kikuyu who they are. Go to clans. How many clans were there in the Kikuyu society? 9. Every Kikuyu was born into one of 9 clans. Now, in the 1930s, if there were 1 million Kikuyu, that would mean something on the order of 100,000 plus in each of those clans. And indeed, in many Bantu societies in particular, you'll find a number around 9, 10, 12, 14, which seems to be typical in terms of the number of clans. And everyone is slotted either through a matrilineal process or a patrilineal line into one of those. So clans tend to be very large units. They're spread far and wide, and the chances are very good that you, in fact, don't know the great majority of the fellow members of your clan. This is one of those cases where you agree to believe, you assume that you are descended, in the Kikuyu case, from one of 9 original ancestor figures. Lineage, on the other hand, I would put it this way, are the local, knowable, identifiable representatives in your particular local community of that wider descent group of the clan. So at the local level, you're more likely to use a term like lineage. At a larger or a wider level, a clan. But both of them unilineal descent groups. Now, patrilineal, at base, these are systems of logic. And in a lot of ways, the Western world is used to patrilineal forms of logic. I mean, if you take the traditional way of assigning children last names, that's patrilineal logic. You know, they inherited from one parent, not the other. Matrilineal systems tend to throw us somewhat. This is a little bit tougher to parse, to analyze, and so forth. For instance, am I saying that in a matrilineal culture, a matrilineal society, that a man's children are not part of his lineage? That a man's own children are not part of his primary descent group? Yes, I am saying that. That's exactly what I'm saying. Now, his line continues, but it cannot continue through him because he's a male. It will continue through his sister. We'll come back to that and we'll illustrate it in some later lectures. Don't confuse matrilineal with matriarchal. These are quite separable entities. Matriarchal would mean women holding power, dominating positions of power. And I don't have to tell you that that is relatively unusual. There have been instances, but they are uncommon in African history as elsewhere. So it's quite possible to have a patriarchal system where, for instance, the expectation is that a male is going to inherit the kingship from a male, and yet that inheritance will follow matrilineal rules of succession. Again, we'll get into some examples of this when we look at places that were matrilineal and patriarchal, like the old kingdom of Ghana that we encounter in lecture number 10. In general, patrilineal systems are more common in Africa, though there tend to be some matrilineal belts in both West Africa and East Africa. It's difficult to explain why matrilineal, as opposed to patrilineal, emerges long ago in almost the unknowable past. Some have tried to associate matrilineal descent with matrilocality, just to take these prefixes and suffixes another step. In other words, the notion that it's the husband that goes and lives with the bride's family as opposed to the reverse. And some in turn have suggested that bride service, that is a male a husband performing service for his bride's parents, takes the place of bride wealth, a transfer of wealth from the husband to the bride's family. Some have suggested that matrilineality and matrilocality are more likely in places, for instance, without cattle. In other words, if you don't have cattle for that transferable bride wealth, then bride service is going to be more likely. That would imply matrilocality, and this would make matrilineal descent more likely. That works in some places. I got to tell you, the place I know best, which is the Tonga peoples of southern Zambia, quite firmly a matrilineal culture for a long time. Cattle keepers, and very fond indeed of their cattle. Okay, now membership in a particular descent group, I mean, what difference does this make? Membership in a particular descent group tends to matter most at critical milestones of life, I would say. At birth, you're born into one or the other. You're born into something. At marriage, at the birth of one's own children, where you pass on membership or your spouse does. And at death, because death, of course, raises these questions of inheritance, and matrilineal versus patrilineal can readily affect that. Take marriage, for instance, at the time of your own marriage. It's not unusual to find, let's play the GAM game again. It's not unusual to find rules of exogamous marriage in a number of African cultures. And essentially what that means is marrying outside the group, of course. And a lot of times it is the descent group. In other words, the ideal marriage partner should come not from my own clan, but from, a spouse from one of the others. Exogamous rules of marriage. So your range of choice there is constrained. Not a whole lot, but it is constrained. It affects the marriage situation. Crucial milestones of life. The other time that they have tended to matter, that is the solidarities built around unilineal descent, is at times of stress or crisis, when one needs help or is obliged to give it. The great anthropologist Elizabeth Colson likes to define kinship that way. Who can I turn to for assistance? Who am I obligated to assist? Well, let's look at another building block here. In many parts of Africa, age sets or age grades, uniting males or females born within a few years of one another, have occupied important places in the social structure. Age sets are not based on actual kinship. The members are drawn from all the families, all the descent groups in a given locality. But the members develop a kind of quasi-kinship from going through crucial experiences like initiation into manhood. In Nelson Mandela's autobiography, he gives a very riveting account, a very graphic account at some point, of his initiation at the age of about 16 into adulthood. And he, of course, goes through that experience with the fellow members of his age set. Now, age sets then, like exogamous marriage, cut across the lines of descent. In other words, exogamous marriage unites people from different descent groups, from different clans. Age sets unite peoples from various different descent groups. Now, these kinds of cross-cutting ties, as I will call them, are particularly important in what we can call stateless societies. In other words, societies in old Africa, I won't say a whole lot about it now, but who did not have state structures, which did not have authority structures involving kings and rulers and so forth. Because these linkages across the descent groups tended to act as a brake, a B-R-A-K-E. They retarded and acted as an incentive not to allow the loyalties based on descent to degenerate into feud or civil war, because you had crucial relationships, exogamous marriage relationships. You had fellow members of your age set who were members of that other clan, that other lineage, that other descent group. Now, we've been discussing kinship in the biological sense, I suppose, the most basic sense. There is no kinship without gender. This may be a moment just to, not in any detail, but to say a word or two about women and women's status in African societies. Easy generalizations about oppressed African women are fraught with danger. Were there African queens? Yes. Were there formidable female soldiers? Yes. Do ordinary women have considerable resources of power? Yes. Still, we would err, and I think err substantially, to imagine that there was an essential equality, past or present. I would hasten to add that that is true, of course, of many, probably most other places as well. But issues like polygyny, issues like bride wealth, and maybe most controversially of all, issues like female circumcision, or what its opponents call female genital mutilation, FGM. These raise very serious questions about women's status on the first level. They also raise questions of a more universal sort, which I will encapsulate by saying that it raises questions of cultural relativism. That is, the notion that each culture has the right to decide essentially what's right and wrong, how it wants to practice life. Cultural relativism versus notions of universal human rights. Is polygynous marriage something that no woman should have to suffer? It would seem a little hypocritical for me, having taken in the generosity of the polygynous household with which I've stayed so often, to make that. On the other hand, something like female circumcision, FGM to its opponents, may raise a more universal notion of something that shouldn't happen to anyone. Let me stress that female circumcision is not universal in Africa. It's virtually unknown in southern Africa, but it is certainly practiced, especially in northeastern Africa, places like Somalia and parts of Kenya, and in parts of West Africa. Now, again, without resolving those, I think it is important to at least put them on the table and return to them at the very end of this course. Okay, I want to move to a very important subject indeed. What about Africa's legendary tribes? Now, tribes is a word that I usually use in quotation marks. The word tribe itself has an interesting history. In the Western world, tribe has been part of a group of words that have often conveyed images of the primitive, the savage, uncivilized. Who lives in Africa? Well, the natives do. Well, what do they live in? Oh, they live in tribes. Well, what are they like? They're primitive. I mean, when I was growing up, a sentence like a phrase like a tribe of primitive natives would practically roll off the tongue. So it seemed to be bundled up with a whole series of stereotypical images. Okay, but if you go to Africa itself, at least certainly in my experience, and I will stand by this, if you encounter at the University of Zimbabwe or University of Nairobi, Africans who are conversing, let's say, in English and using the term tribe, they're using it in a very value-neutral way. They're using it to get at a form of identity. They're using it to get at ethnic identity. They are trying to describe either themselves or others in terms of one of these forms of identity. Again, to go to Nelson Mandela's autobiography, in the first 2 pages of that autobiography, Mandela uses the word tribe no less than 4 times. He doesn't put it in quotation marks. He obviously doesn't, Mandela would be the last person on earth to describe Africans, in the kind of negative terminology that I've been talking about. He's trying to introduce himself. He's trying to identify himself. And he uses the word tribe to describe a group or groups that he is a part of or that others are part of. Very value neutral. Who am I? Okay. Ethnic identity matters. Sometimes it matters a lot. Sometimes it's a life and death matter. Sometimes it doesn't matter much at all. But what exactly is it? I'm going to suggest a few criteria, but I will stress now and later, no single criterion always works in trying to locate or nail down ethnic identity. It is above all fluid, changeable. It also is a product of history. It is overlapping, and we'll see that again and again. Now, ethnic identity does usually imply descent from a particular population which was once at least concentrated in a particular home area, even if many, maybe most, of the descendants are now scattered far and wide. Think of the language which is used nowadays to talk about ethnicity in the United States. It often is 2-word phrases. It's sometimes hyphenated, sometimes not. The last word is often American, and the first word is what? Irish American, African American, Italian American, Asian American. The first of those 2 in the pair, in each case, is a place. And it's a place from which people have descended from a population at one time concentrated in that place. Let's move on. Ethnic identity usually implies a degree of cultural difference in Africa as it does elsewhere. When we talk about differences between Italian culture and German culture, We might go to things like styles of music or cuisine or clothing. Well, the same can be said about Tonga and Bemba and Zulu and Vinda and so forth in Africa. But I do enter a note of caution here. This has often been the stuff of stereotype, as we know perfectly well. So the notion that everybody in that ethnic group does it this way, can easily descend into stereotypes which may not only be derogatory, but downright misleading. Still, if you take culture seriously, then you have to take cultural difference seriously. And this is one of the factors which can go into who am I, who are my people, who are those people, partly because we do or think certain things differently from them. Now, in Africa, if I had to bet on one criterion of cultural difference to distinguish between ethnic groups, I would put my bet on differences in language. What is language? Language, in a sense, is a catalog of ways of doing things and ways of thinking about things. It's a catalog of culture. Language difference is, again, probably the best bet criterion, I think, for locating ethnic differences. Am I saying that, is it a fair thing to say that in South Africa, where there are now 11 different official languages, that can be used to say that, yes, there are about 11 major ethnic groups in South Africa? Yes, I would say that. And I think it would work pretty well for places like Tanzania, Nigeria, also. But again, nothing ever works all the time. The deadliest example of ethnic hostility in recent Africa was something we'll devote a lecture to, and that is the genocide in Rwanda in 1994. Now, there's a lot more than ethnicity involved in that, as we'll get to, but you would have to be foolish not to recognize that notions of Hutu versus Tutsi were a big part of that story. Well, guess what? Hutu and Tutsi speak the same language. So the criterion which I just put my money on, in fact, doesn't work in a dramatic case where ethnic difference made a lot of difference. So, I would emphasize yet again that ethnicity is fluid and changeable. It's not primeval and fixed. In that sense, it's related to conceptions of so-called race. And in fact, it's a fair question to ask. What about race? Is that part of ethnic identity? It often seems so. Sometimes in this culture, in American culture, ethnicity and so-called race are often used almost interchangeably, I would suggest, though, that they are different, though often overlapping categories. Again, take the South African example. In terms of so-called race, legally for a time, there were certainly blacks in South Africa and certainly whites, and it made a considerable difference. But as part of that so-called black racial category, there were at least 9 different ethnic groups, and indeed 9 different major languages within that group. Within the racially determined white category, there were at least 2 major ethnic identities, Afrikaner and English. So overlaps can affect it, but I think there are useful distinctions to keep apart. Now, there's been a long tendency, I'm afraid, in Western considerations of Africa approaches, perhaps especially among the media, to think that ethnicity trumps all, If a coup takes place or there is conflict, that the name of the game is, in a sense, to find the tribe, and then the tribes involved, and you understand it all. Sometimes it explains a great deal. Sometimes it doesn't explain much at all. Let me give an example again from South Africa. It's been common in news reports out of South Africa for 2 or 3 decades to take a prominent South African, and I'm thinking of Mangosuthu Buthelezi, the head of the Inkatha movement in South Africa, not part of the ANC, the ruling party, to take Buthelezi, and he'll often be labeled in stories from the mainstream press in the West as the spokesman of the Zulu, the leader of the Zulu, and so forth. Now, indeed, most of Buthelezi's followers in his movement are Zulu. it is fair to say that he has tried to build, or did try to build, something of a Zulu nationalist movement. But to say that most of his followers are Zulu is a logically quite different statement from saying that most or all Zulu are followers of Buthelezi. If I say that all the people listening to this lecture are intelligent, that doesn't mean that all intelligent people are listening to this lecture. So these are logical differences. In fact, there are many thoroughly Zulu people in South Africa, and I'm talking about parts of Zulu royalty who were never part of Buthelezi's movement. So when we've said Zulu, we haven't said it all. We haven't explained it all. Ethnicity is an important factor there, as it is in so many other places, but it has to be combined with other units of analysis to get a full understanding. In the end, then, my suggestion on ethnic identity in Africa is this: don't ignore it, but don't exaggerate it. Look at it in context. Thank you.